Good afternoon, all, and thank you for joining us today for this event co-hosted by the Atlantic Council Counselors Program and the Scowcroft Middle East Security Initiative. I'm Suzanne Kiampour, BBC Washington reporter, and we have gathered today an extraordinary group of people here to engage in conversation with Shabtai Shavit, former director of Israel's Mossad and chairman of the board at the International Institute for Counterterrorism of the Interdisciplinary Center Herzliya. I'd also like to thank the Mayor Group for sponsoring this discussion that will focus on Director Shavit's new book, Head of the Mossad in Pursuit of a Safe and Secure Israel, and a host of regional issues, including the recently signed Abraham Accords. We've reserved time for questions for Director Shavit after the panel, so I invite everyone to submit your questions via the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen throughout the event. And if you're watching one of our live streams on YouTube or Twitter, we welcome you to tweet your questions to us using hashtag #ACMideast. And before we turn to our panel, Ambassador James Woolsey, Jr., former director of the CIA, will introduce Director Shavit.
Director, could you unmute? Director, can you unmute yourself? Ambassador, can you unmute yourself?
Okay, there you go.
Ambassador, if you want to begin again.
Begin again.
Okay. When I took over as a director of Central Intelligence for the U.S. Some 40 or so years ago, I wasn't sure how things were going to go. We had just had the Pollard case and rather substantial tensions between Israel and the United States, and particularly in the world of intelligence. And my concerns were not only alleviated, but deep-sixed because I started everything with a walk in the garden. Everybody starts with a walk in the garden. Walk in the garden with Shabtai. He was a delightful guy. He was articulate. He was smart. He was shrewd. He was open and fair. And we had a great walk in the park. That kept going in a sense, that walk in the park, for me, for a couple of years, for Shabtai for several years longer than that. But the intelligence business is not an easy business to manage. And it's not something that you can deal with in a casual fashion. You have to care about your colleague. You have to care about your people on your own side, and you have to level with them. You can't just let things noodle along. Intelligence is especially important in these days and times. We were then, to some extent, and are now, embodied in dealing with the world of terrorism, and terrorists can cause terrible pain, suffering, and death. And you don't know when they're going to come upon you, whether it's 9/11 or a terrorist attack in Israel, or both. And I think it's also now in this world of essentially technology fear that we have to be very, very careful to deal with that problem, that we are in a world of intelligence death, and we can't just live it in a comfortable and easygoing and bureaucratic way. We are not the State Department. And we are, I think, in a very, very troubling world we have just published several books in the United States, including one by me and my counterpart. And each one, in its own way, shows how dangerous things can be, how dangerous they are. We have, therefore, we have to make sure that we are dotting every I, crossing every T, and moving in the depths of concern and allaying the fears of our citizens and our other government officials, but not allaying them too much. We need them realistically afraid. So with that for now, I'd like it to turn it over to my colleagues and let them talk, John and others, as they wish. And I'm especially happy to be able to start off this round of discussions, to start it with Mossad, to start it with John Deutsch, to start it with several people that really matter, both to me and to their countries. Thank you.
Director, you wanted to begin?
Well, I'm amazed to see here friends that my friendship with them goes back decades, and I'm very moved to see these two gentlemen, Jim and John, and I feel very proud to have them making the effort to agree to this, to attend this meeting and talk. I recall the years that we were cooperating together to the benefit of our two countries, and I am proud to say that we did everything possible, that our contribution to the security of the United States will be not smaller than the opposite. And it's not for me to judge, it's for Jim and John to judge and to address this point. Very many memories from those years, and the one that Jim mentioned, the Pollard affair, is not one of the pleasant side of the cooperation. I recall the discussion on the topic, and I recall that I told Jim that I pray that no other head of the Mossad will need to be in this same situation that I was there. I recall very many meetings and discussions and activities with John during his tenure as the director of the CIA, and especially one vignette, if you like, during one of his visits to Israel, all of a sudden he asked me, say, can you introduce me to one of your experts on satellites? And I was very much surprised because according to our system, the Mossad does not have any responsibility in the field of satellites. But nevertheless, John asked, and I obeyed, and I brought one of our people with whom he was sitting talking for an hour or so, and then he told me, listen, if I had a dozen of this kind, I would be able to do even better than what I'm doing now, which for me was the compliment that I could ever dream of. So hello, Jim, and hello, John, and it's wonderful to see you. And I pass the microphone to you again.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Director, and we're so happy to be with you and your wonderful book here today. Congratulations on the publication. I want to begin, Director, before we go to the panel, with a few questions. You, in the early 70s, were posted to Kurdistan in southwestern Iran. Tell us what you learned about Iran while you were living there, its people, and what surprised you. And if you were to attend dinner this evening with the Supreme Leader, what would be your objectives at that dinner? And what would you specifically, given your background, be analyzing about the Supreme Leader?
Well, I think that I'll start with the second half of your question. If I would have sit with the Supreme Leader today, I would do my utmost in order to get a hint or a better understanding to the following question. If and when you are going to have the military nuclear capability, are you going to behave pragmatically or messianically? I believe that this is the most important question to understand to all those who sit on chairs where decisions are being made. Because there is argument among the experts. There are those who would tell you that the Iranians are pragmatists, and they can bring you an example or two from the history. For instance, the case that people bring as a proof is that in 2003, the Iranian made a decision to stop the development of the military side of the nuclear project. And they did it because they believed that the Second Gulf War, meaning the American attack on Iraq, was only the starter of a much wider operation, and Iran most probably will be the next target of the Americans. So this is a proof of a pragmatic kind of thinking. I don't really accept it. We have a country that is being run by Ayatollah, Shiite Ayatollah, and I stress the definition Shiite, because the Shiite is considered in the various different religious group in Islam is considered to be one of the, maybe the most extreme in its beliefs. And just to give an example, the supreme leader, according to the Shiite belief, is considered to be infallible. In other words, whatever he says comes straight from the mouth of Allah. So would it be far-fetched to imagine that once he has got the capability, he wakes up in the morning, calls his guys and tell them, listen, I had a talk with Allah tonight, and he instructed me to push the button. So go, fellas, and push the button. This is what is meant by, is he going to be to behave pragmatically, rationally, or is he going to follow the Shiite Islam tenets and commands? Another point that we should bear in mind is that the Shiites divide the world into two camps. The camp of Islam and the camp of the infidels. They don't distinguish between Christians, Jews, Amharis, or whoever. The world is two camps. One is or two houses. In Arabic, it's Dar al-Islam and Dar al-Harb. Our people who understand a bit of Arabic will vouch that I spell it, I pronunciate it correctly. And those who live in the house of Islam are instructed by the Shiite belief to fight the infidels in order either to convert them to become true believers, or else to make do with them, to kill them. And the purpose of this war, which is considered to be eternal, is at the end of it, when all the infidels will disappear from planet Earth, they'll be able to build the eternal Muslim caliphate. Every time that I tell this story, I feel like telling a story from Middle East times, but this is the true story today, every day.
Well,
and okay, go on.
Yeah, I was just saying, in your book, you lay down so many key hallmarks of when you've laid the groundwork for the Abraham Accords. And given that Prime Minister Netanyahu is visiting the UAE tomorrow, even that I'm sure in your lifetime you had hoped for an Israel Prime Minister to be visiting a Muslim country. Do you see a future, Director, where Mossad, the House of Saud, and the Iranian people can coexist in the Middle East to fight extremism? And do the Abraham Accords advance that future?
Look, let me tell you the following. I and my predecessors and my successors, all of them, visited all those countries. All the visits were clandestine, were secret visits, but relationship and contact between Israel and between most of the countries, the Arab countries, were a place where we used to meet and used to sit and used to talk and used to dwell on war and peace and what can be done in order to achieve peace. the situation today, and I pray that Netanyahu will take this opportunity in order to pursue the objectives which I refer to. This is a unique point of time where a new axis in the Middle East, which is being led by the United States, and where Israel and Arab countries, the moderate ones, the Sunni ones, share the same objectives and the same targets, is really unique, that should be taken and done. But for that, the U.S. administration first to study it and to accept it.
So I want to turn to and bring in Anna Schechter from NBC News. Anna, thank you so much for joining us. Give us your thoughts, Anna. I know you've looked at this on Israel-China relations. How has that evolved since the time of COVID? How has it evolved? And what do you see as the balancing act Israel has to play? And I know you want to then ask the director a similar realm in that question.
It's such a great question that you pose. It's a fascinating dynamic and balancing act because economics come into play, intelligence come into play, so many factors. And there are so many different players that have to be either appeased or Israel has to be wary of. So actually, Director Shavit, I think you are posed to answer this in a really interesting way. Can you share a little bit about what the Israel-China relationship was like when you were director and how it has evolved and how do you see it now?
Well, I'll start by saying that the intelligence relationship between the Chinese and Israel started during my tenure. And the initiative came on the side of the Chinese. They asked via an intermediary. Usually in the world of intelligence, there are intermediaries who are making the connections. And they ask such an intermediary who came to me and asked me and told me, listen, the Chinese want to establish intelligence relationship. And I told him, let me think of it and I'll come back to you. And by saying I think of it, I meant that I would go to my prime minister in order to report and to recommend that we should do it, and then to give an answer. And the first meeting was between myself and my Chinese counter in a third country. And when we sat together, and after niceties, I told him, listen, we can speak according to the foreign ministry protocol, or to look at each one at the other eyes, and to speak like we, people who speak straight and don't hide their feelings. And he, after a minute of second, a meeting of thought, he turned to me and told me, Let's shoot at each other straight. So I told him my first question is the following. We are such a small country, and we are such a small intelligence organization. And you are the largest country in the world, demographically and geographically. What was the reason that you?
Why were they interested? Yeah.
What kind of communication, cooperation we can have with each other? By the way, in brackets, I'll come back to this, but in brackets, I can tell you that in another meeting after a few months, I brought up with him the issue of the Uyghurs in the western province of China, which are considered to be, they are Muslims and they are being persecuted and they are being considered by the Chinese as terrorists and opposition. And once I brought up this question, he told me, listen, we consider it a domestic issue. We don't bring it up. We don't discuss on it with foreigners. So, okay, now I come back to the first meeting, and he tells me, since you are straight with me, I'll be straight with you. Our main priority, I'm talking now about 1991. He told me our first priority is Western technology. And you are very advanced in technology. And you have excellent relationship and cooperation with the US. And we are interested also in American technology. Back in 91, the first meeting between two heads of two different intelligence officers, they didn't hide what was their ultimate goal then, which exists today as well.
It puts you in an awkward position.
Indeed, it does. I want to turn to you, Will Rich, former U.S. Treasury attaché to the UAE and Oman. And Will, you're very well positioned to talk to us today. How do you see the economic relationships between the Gulf states and Israel in particular evolving in the years ahead? What sectors will thrive? What role will the Gulf sovereign wealth funds play? Will the U.S. get cut out of these economic deals? And then I know you have a question for the director. So, Will?
Yeah, thanks, Michael. Thanks for having me here today. Political and security interests have brought the governments of Israel, the UAE, and Bahrain together in the Abraham Accords, but it's really economic interests that will truly tie these countries together and the broader region together. Prior to the Accords, the Middle East and North Africa region had one of the lowest rates of trade within its region in the world, with just 5% of exports from MENA countries going to their neighbors. From when the agreement was signed in mid-August until January, trade between the UAE and Israel has topped $272 million, which sounds like a huge figure in just few months. But the fact is that much of that trade was largely already occurring. It was just happening through intermediaries set up in Cyprus, Jordan, and Lebanon, among other places, to get around the longstanding embargoes. Those firms are in the process of moving directly to the Gulf, largely here in Dubai, where I am. And that will have some immediate but fleeting benefits. In the short term, the deal is great for Israel, which already has a lot of developed firms and products that are really just in need of additional markets. It's going to be harder for Gulf-based and other MENA firms to penetrate the Israeli market because of how developed not just the competitor firms are, but the financing, research, and technology development ecosystems around them. You mentioned the sovereign wealth funds, and there is a potential role for them to play, but I don't think they're really situated well to foster the type of innovation-driven economic activity that the UAE and Bahrain are moving towards. The GCC sovereign wealth funds are generally pretty risk adverse and invest in a very long-term time frame. And with a few notable exceptions, like the UAE's Mubadala, they aren't really in the business of driving innovation through direct investment. That's really the job of private sector venture capital firms. And last year, Israeli companies attracted about $10 billion in venture capital funding, while the entire MENA region received about $1 billion. And that's really just not enough to spur the type of innovation economy that the Gulf states are moving towards. So in the medium to long term for the Gulf, it's all about creating the conditions for success. And Israel and the United States can play huge roles here, providing partnerships, education, licensing, research and technology, and being the source of venture capital, because obviously US venture capitalists invest worldwide. To attract that investment, there needs to be further improvements to the business climate in the region, including modern bankruptcy laws, intellectual property protections, and major state investments in research and development that can be spun off into companies years down the line. And as I mentioned, some of that has already started, but it's not finished yet and will take some time to have an impact. So in the short term, the added costs of indirect trade are being removed. But in the medium to long term, there are some additional business climate investments that need to be made now to really reap the benefits of the new trade relationships. I think the accords are a step in that direction. And obviously the first step in the right direction is the most important. As for my question for Director Shavit, I'd like to shift to the COVID-19 pandemic for a second and really touch on something we were talking about before the session started. I think it's fair to say that as the spread of the virus gained momentum, it went to the very top of intelligence collection requirements of every major intelligence service in the world. So it's not a surprise that the Mossad and your successor, the current director, had an active role in obtaining vaccines and protective gear. But what is surprising is that the Mossad's role would be publicly acknowledged both in the Israeli press and by the Prime Minister directly. So Director Shavit, would you please explain why the Mossad was well situated to serve a critical role in Israel's COVID-19 response, and why the Israeli government would have chosen to go public about that role? Thank you.
Look, I didn't attend the meetings where those decisions were made to engage the Mossad in running around places all around the world in order to bring medical staff and so on. From my answer, you pretty much can understand that not only it surprised me, I was completely against it, but I am not in a position of decision making today in this, but it was entirely not necessary. And judging from the successes, I'm sure that my viewpoint is correct. There are so many other issues that the Mossad should spend its time on that this was not necessary. It might have given some flavor of operations and sting operations and cloak and dagger kind operations too. Not more than that.
So I want to turn, Director, to Halim McCroft.
But excuse me, I just want to add a few sentences. It's a good opportunity for me to be transparent and to tell you that among other sins of mine, I'm involved in business these days, and I'm connected with the Israeli company who sponsors this event, and I've been to the Gulf, but the Gulf that I knew was almost a desert, there was no skyscrapers, there was no highways, there was no, it was half a desert. Personally, I'm very much triggered to visit again and to see how it is there. And when it comes to business, I do have some ideas and suggestions to recommend to the average Israeli businessman as how to operate in this kind of markets, and not so much from the point of view of finances, but from the point of view of relation between human beings.
Well, the wedding market between Israel and the UAE, as we discussed, is booming. And so I think that is one market that I would certainly look for a future investment. Halima Croft, I want to bring you in, Managing Director of RBC. And, you know, Halima, talk to us about the current energy price dynamics. You know, there was recently an important OPEC meeting. Saudi opted to hold their barrels off the market. Halima, what do you think this means for pricing going forward, potentially the willingness of Iran coming back to the table as it's getting a measure of financial relief? And then I know you have a question for the director.
Thank you so much, Michael. And thank you so much, Director, for joining us today. As you mentioned, Michael, I mean, oil prices have moved up, you know, rapidly this year. One of the biggest, you know, stories we've seen is the reconciliation between OPEC and Russia. Just 1 year ago, I was actually in Vienna and then in Saudi Arabia when the Saudis and Russians could not reach an agreement to put a floor under prices and to make a significant production cut. You know, we've seen since April when they announced that 9.7 million barrel a day agreement that OPEC unity with Russia has largely held together. Now, I think there are some important geopolitical dynamics we can talk about as, you know, Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov is now in the Gulf. But we've seen really recently the Saudis, I would say, really take back control of this oil market. And I think a crucial decision that the Saudis made was in January when they announced that they would do a unilateral 1 million barrel a day production cut. We had seen already Asian demand recovering. We had seen optimism about the vaccine, but I think it really was the Saudis saying, like, we are going to provide additional rocket fuel to this market, you know, with their unilateral cut that really has given us this sort of bounce. And at the last OPEC meeting that we just, you know, saw last week, there had been question marks over when Saudi Arabia would phase out that cut, when OPEC would start putting more barrels back onto the market, because, you know, Russian officials had indicated a desire to start, you know, ramping up output again, I think with an eye to U.S. shale growth. But the Saudis came out and essentially said they're going to hold those barrels off the market. They are focused not on discussions about are we in a new super cycle for all commodities, but really shots in the arm. And so, you know, the fact that the Saudis are willing to keep those barrels off the market, signal that when those barrels return, it'll be a slow, phased return, I think is giving, you know, additional support to this oil market, which raises, I think, a very important geopolitical question, which I actually would like to ask the director about. You know, in a rising oil price environment, we have been seeing Iran, you know, in the last, you know, quarter, really putting more barrels on the market. Like, yes, they remain subject to U.S. sanctions, but we have seen an increase in Iranian barrels making it into China, for example. They seem to become more adept at getting around these sanctions. And so the question I have is, you know, what will Iran's willingness be to come back to the table if they continue to circumvent sanctions in a rising oil price environment? And do you really anticipate that we will be looking at some type of agreement, you know, with Iran and the P5+1 that could lead to more meaningful sanctions relief? Or are we going to be in a sort of diplomatic stalemate over the next, you know, 12 to 18 months? So thank you again for joining us, Director, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts.
Well, the Iranians will reciprocate on any topic of a future negotiation based on what the other party will propose to them. In this respect, I can tell you that I don't know about more articulate negotiators than the Iranians. They can wear out any partner with whom they negotiate. And then knowing a little bit the Americans, the Americans does not have the 10% of the patience for negotiations as compared to the Iranians. And I'm telling it to you because I have learned my Farsi in the Iranian bazaar in Tehran. And there, one of the first things that I've learned is the art of negotiations of them, which is based on patience and perseverance. You may know that the best carpets are Iranian carpets, and why are they so good? Because those who with them are kids, 10 years old, 8 years old, 11 years old, with very small hands, so they can make the smallest knots of the threads of the carpets, and a small carpet can take a year to weave. Think about the patience that one needs in order to do it. Only the Iranians know it. So, if one day, soon I believe, the negotiations will resume, the only one prediction that I can make is that the Iranians who really want to change the situation and really want to reach an agreement, but they would only be willing to give anything if the balance between what they get and what they give is on their side. I don't know if I satisfied you with this answer, but this is my answer.
No, I think that was great. Director, I want to turn to Hagar Chamali, who's CEO and founder of Granite Strategies and also former Treasury colleague of mine, and someone that knows a lot about Hezbollah. And there's been talk for years and years now on the question of Hezbollah and Israel preparing for a second showdown after the 2006 war. But it's been almost 15 years. And if that were really true, wouldn't it have happened by now? And so, Hagar, I want to ask you, what are Israel's goals here when it comes to Hezbollah containment, undermine to influence operations? I'd love your sense of, is there going to be mutually assured destruction, but without nuclear weapons? Hagar, and then I know you have a question on Hezbollah for the director.
Thanks, Michael, and thank you, Director Shavit. I'm so excited to be here. So as the director agrees, and he has said this before, Iran has two major goals, and that's to take over the Middle East and become a nuclear power. And sometimes I find when people talk about Hezbollah as part of the Lebanese fabric or Lebanese society, and that we have to somehow magically convince it to become only a political party, that they are missing the fact that Hezbollah is an arm of the Iranian government. And without that, it will basically cease to exist, or at least it would be an entirely different entity. So it poses a real threat to Israel for that reason, and quite frankly to Lebanon, but that's not what we're discussing today. But eliminating Hezbollah, to me at least, doesn't seem achievable ever. And if that were the case, it would have been eliminated at some point during its nearly 40 years of existence. And you see lately, I'm sure many people have seen this, a lot of analysts saying that Hezbollah's influence has been undermined over the last few years, as reflected by the protests in Lebanon and visions of their involvement in corruption and criminality, and certainly the falling economy there, their involvement in Syria. And while it's true that there's been increased disaffection, their hold on the political situation in Lebanon has never been stronger. And so now we know that, which brings me to the point about this showdown that both sides are allegedly preparing for. We know that they've been preparing for the possibility of aggression. And given the fact that it hasn't happened, and that there have been since then small skirmishes or possibilities that could have ignited conflict, and they still didn't result in conflict, it means that there's some kind of false stability in the fact that conflict between the two would be so extremely dangerous. So but at the same time, you see the more Hezbollah arms itself and the more Iran develops its nuclear program, that false stability that you have, this kind of bizarre containment, could really rock, things could really shake up there. So, the thing that I view is that, the thing that I keep thinking is that, on one hand, the international community needs to hold Iran back even further, right? This underscores the argument for that, and certainly prevent its nuclear program from moving forward. But also it makes me wonder how far ahead Israel is thinking on how stronger Hezbollah could look, what that would mean for them, and perhaps whether a new balance could be achieved or some kind of containment if Israel finds perhaps moderate partners in Lebanon, which is something, not a lot of people have written about that. It's something I'd like to explore personally. So I'm sure Israel is thinking of this, but I fear the repercussions of the stronger Hezbollah are sooner than many appreciate, which brings me to my question to the director, which is, how do you think Israel should be approaching Hezbollah from a broader strategic standpoint? What should the overarching goal vis-a-vis Hezbollah be on the part of Israel? And is there something you would change in Israel's current approach?
Well, I'll do my best in order to be short and concise in my response. The Hezbollah phenomenon is a story of a small minority in Lebanon of Shiites who decades ago was the weakest and the most undeveloped and economically retarded in Lebanon. And from that position, within few decades, they have become the #1 power in the country. That is not a big deal, because when you try to identify the other powers today in Lebanon, you can hardly find any who can compete with the Hezbollah. Now, strategically and militarily, we consider Hezbollah as being a Iranian division. It means that they operate under instructions and orders that come from Tehran. So when we are making our intelligence estimates and evaluations, one of the major parameters that we have to consider is Iran and not Hezbollah, because Hezbollah, for all practical purposes, is only a tool in the hands of Iran. One, two, we don't want another war or another round of fighting with the Hezbollah. Hezbollah on their side, they don't want, at this point of time, I'm saying, today they don't want either to break up the situation. We are doing everything possible and to a very large extent with your country's cooperation to build up a defensive system and capability in order to cope with the most advanced missiles that they have, and they have a huge quantity of surface-to-surface missiles and with precision systems and so on and so forth. So we are not sitting idle. We are investing a lot in building the answer to that threat. And the third point, and this is my personal understanding.
And Director, that ties really well into bringing Will Weschler in, the Director of the Middle East Programs at the Atlantic Council. Will, thank you so much for joining us. Will, I want to pose to you, will the Biden administration continue the Trump administration's efforts to encourage normalization between Israel and the Arab countries? Do you think the Abraham Accords contribute more generally to peace in the region? And then I know you want to direct that to the Director before we close. So, Will, thank you.
If this development of the upgraded relations between Israel and the Emirates and others will be leveraged correctly, it can become a springboard for the end of the never-ending crisis between Israel and the Palestinians.
Mr. Director, let me just jump in on that, because I think your point is a very strong one. I think that just to answer Michael's question, I think that the Biden administration will certainly continue to try to seek greater normalizations between Israel and a number of other states in the region. I don't know that it's going to be as willing to upend long-standing U.S. policies in order to do so as did its predecessor in some instances. But I do think that it shares it sees the value certainly of such normalizations. And I also, just as you were just starting to say, Director, think that one of the unfortunate circumstances right now is that the leaders in the Palestinian community and the leaders certainly of the Palestinian Authority and of Hamas are responding very negatively to these normalizations and don't see it in their interests. In fact, it's easy to imagine circumstances in which over the longer term it works to benefit the Palestinians and address the longstanding Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I was by the way, I read your book. I thought it was really excellent, and I encourage other people to do so. And of course, it was written before the Abraham Accords came out, but you were prescient in writing it. That you noted that first and foremost, many states, especially those in the Gulf, you wrote were tired of the Palestinian effort and ascribed more criticism to the Palestinian leadership than was probably appreciated. And you also talked about how the Gulf Arabs and especially Saudi Arabia could play a really unique role in ending or addressing this conflict. Can you explain a little bit more about what you wrote and what you're thinking now?
Well, today I think differently as compared to a few years ago because of the new development with the Gulf states and the change of guard in the White House, and my recipe is not an instant operation. I'm talking about a long-term process in the Middle East where you start with building a new axis, American, Israeli, Middle Eastern, Sunni, moderate Arab countries, Saudi Arabia included. once you have it, the Israelis and Palestinians will sit together, and it was a situation where such a pressure will build up on the two parties that they won't have any other choice but to sign to end the conflict, based on the idea of two-state solution, based on the Arab League or the Saudi proposal of 2002. It's a long process, and the rate of success is based also on the notion that this structure, which I am talking about, will not only be a regional one, it will affect the global situation. US vis-a-vis China and Russia, US vis-a-vis not only Iraq, but Turkey as well, which is undergoing a very rapidly process of becoming a Sharia country. So I'm talking about building a mechanism and dynamics which will certainly bring once and for all the end of this conflict.
Thank you, Director, for such insightful comments, fascinating conversation. I recommend everyone buy this. This is a wonderful book and such important attributes that you made during it. I want to thank our esteemed panel so much for joining us today. And Suzanne, I'd love to turn it over to you to close. Thank you very much, Director. It was a dear pleasure. Suzanne?
Thank you to our panelists, and thank you to Michael for that engaging conversation. And I also want to thank Director Shavit for taking the time to join us and share some of your insight and incredible stories with us. As a native Farsi speaker, I would love to hear your Farsi. And if I end up getting an interview with Ayatollah Khamenei, I will ask your question on your behalf. And, you know, it was interesting, you mentioned that the Iranians, you learned the art of negotiation from the Iranians and how they have patience and perseverance. I covered the nuclear negotiations and traveled with Secretary Kerry, and I remember the moment where I saw that moment where the Iranians kind of took the lead in terms of the upper hand in the negotiations. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see how the Biden administration builds on the Abraham Accords and what the future of foreign policy, American foreign policy, will look like, which is actually the subject of a documentary I am hosting for the BBC, which you should all watch. So on that note, this event will also be available on Atlantic Council's event page if you want to rewatch it again. Rewatch certain aspects of the conversation. And thank you all for joining us.
And I can bid you farewell in Farsi. Khuda Hafiz.
Khuda Hafiz.
Perfect ending. Thank you again, Director. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.